Hello and welcome to a Talmud Israeli production. Today we will review the highlights of this week's course of Daf Yomi study, Masechet Pesachim, pages 22 through 28, Chafbet through Kavchet. 22. Shimon ha'amsuni ve'amri la Nechemya ha'amsuni hayadorish kletim shebatorah. So there was a certain sage of yesteryear whose name was Shimon, or maybe his name was Nechemya, and he would expound upon the word et every time it appears in the Torah. Now, the word et does not seem to have much substantive significance, but yet, for homiletic purposes, this Nechemya or Shimon Hamsuni is going to offer an interpretation of every word et in the Torah. Kevan shigil et Hashem alakecha tira pirash. As soon as he got to the verse that says, "You shall fear the Lord your God," he stopped, wondering whether it was dangerous theologically to expound on the word et in et Hashem lokecha tira, because after all, what could be compared to the fear we owe to our Maker, to God in heaven? Amru lo tamidav, Rabbi kletim shevadarashta mati alehen. So the student said to the teacher, "But Rabbi, your methodological system of expounding upon every et in the Torah, what do we do with all the other interpretations that you previously did? Shall we throw those out? Are those no longer valid because your system appears to be flawed, since there's one exceptional example where you cannot expound the word et?" Amar lahem, so he responded, Keshem shekibalti sachar ladrisha, kacha kabel schar prisha. His response was, just as I received reward for my good faith effort to expound upon the word et all those previous times, so too I will receive reward for withholding any interpretation in this instance. Until Rabbi Akiva came along and salvaged and saved the whole method, the whole system, by saying that the word et in the verse about fearing God refers to the reverence one must have for Torah scholars. So now every verse that has the word et was able to be interpreted and the system could be saved. Kaf Gimel, 23. Tanan, we learned in a Mishnah, Se'adei ofot chayav dagim, that if a person is a trapper who traps birds and non-domesticated animals and fish, and it turns out that among what you captured you find impure species, you're allowed to sell those non-kosher items to a non-Jew. As Rashi explains, it's only if you happen to trap a few non-kosher items in a larger business being conducted about kosher items. In that instance, you can sell whatever you can't keep and eat for yourself. However, to lechatchila, ab initio, engage in commerce, where the primary function is to sell non-kosher, that you cannot do. 24. Chaf Daled. Kol heichad ika lemidrash, darshinan, v'lumakminan b'la'aviyateri. Whenever we have a situation where there's a verse in Torah that appears to be redundant insofar as all it accomplishes is give you another prohibition, another lav, for violating the same action for which there already is an existing prohibition, we would rather not interpret the Torah in that fashion as doubling down or tripling down on prohibitions for the same action, but rather we would expound upon the verse in a way that it teaches a different scenario, it's a different halacha, that there are a multiplicity of laws rather than the same law many times over, giving you multiple punishments for one action. Kafeh, 25. Tanya, we learned in a Braita. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, im ne'emar b'chol nafshecha, lama ne'emar b'chol mo'odecha. So in the very famous verse, the Ve'ahavta verse, you shall love your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your resources. Why is it that the Torah tells us that we should love God with our souls and also with our financial resources? If we have one, what do we need the other for? There seems to be a redundancy here. Ela lomar lecha, but rather to teach you, there are some people who value their life more than they value their material possessions. Lekach ne'emar b'chol nafshecha, and therefore the Torah says with all your soul, with your life. But there are other people who love their money more than their life. And for that person, we say, B'chol me'odecha. So regardless of where your priorities are, for all people, there is an obligation to have love and reverence of God overshadowing and overriding your pettier concerns. Now, you could say, well, which one is more religiously appropriate? Should we be a person who values our nefesh more than our mammon, or a person who values our mammon more than our nefesh? So undoubtedly, we must value our nefesh more than our mammon. That only a person whose values are warped would say that their dollar is worth more than their life. Chavav 26. Amru alav Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. It was said about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai that he would sit in the shadow of the temple building, the Heichal, and teach a Torah class all day long. What happened? He had many disciples, and there was no spot in Jerusalem large enough to accommodate his crowd other than in the open space under the shadow of the Heichal. And they benefited from the shadow because people don't like to be out in the sun, at least for part of the day, they could be in the shade, courtesy of the temple building. So, but this is an example of having mundane benefit from the Beit HaMikdash, which appears to be forbidden. So the Gemara answers, Rava Marshani Heichal Delatocho Asui. Well, the temple exists, the temple walls exist to protect that which is inside of it. And only incidentally does it cast a shadow on those who are sitting at a distance away. And so therefore, it's not really making use of the temple at all in any legal sense. 27. Tanya. Anything that must be burned because of some halachic consideration, the ashes that are produced after burning that item, is no longer forbidden. You're allowed to benefit from those ashes, with the exception being Atzei Ashera, the Ashera tree, which is related to idolatry, that remains forbidden even in the state of ashes. Ve'fer Hekdesh Lolamaser, and the ashes produced by Hekdesh, by the sacred, by the temple, remain prohibited forever. 28. Kafchat. Lo tochal lav chametz, shivatim l'chalav matzot, that you shall not eat chametz on Passover, 7 days you shall eat matzot. Rabbi Yehuda said that verse exists, l'kovo chova filu bizman hazeh, that verse teaches us that even in the post-temple era, even nowadays, there is an obligation to eat matzah, just as there is an obligation to refrain from eating chametz. The Lota said the prohibitive of chametz corresponds to the positive of matzah. They both apply even in the post-temple era. However, Rabbi Shimon, the Kovo Chova Menale, according to Rabbi Shimon, there is a different source for this obligation. Ba'erev tochlu matzot. So for Rabbi Shimon, it's in the evening you shall eat matzah. Which means, by the way, that according to Torah law, as we rule, now there is only an obligation to eat matzah on the night of the Seder. Subsequent to the night of the Seder, for the rest of Pesach, there is a mitzvah accomplished by eating matzah, but there's no out-and-out obligation. So if someone does not like eating matzah, they can, if they would like to, avoid it. Everyone have a great week.